Hello. Now this audio lecture is for Business Communication class, semester 2. In this audio lecture, I'll talk about delivering negative messages. I repeat again, delivering negative messages. Now before I start my lecture, let me just give you an idea about the outline for this lecture. So first, I'll describe the strategies and goals of business communicators in delivering bad news, including knowing when to use the direct and indirect patterns, or what we call the direct and indirect approaches. Then I'll explain the writing process and how to avoid legal problems related to bad news messages. After that, I will discuss and illustrate techniques for delivering bad news sensitively and effectively. And finally, I will distinguish between ethical and unethical use of the indirect strategy. Now, let's get started. Just as in life, the workplace isn't always a bowl of cherries. What I mean by this is that problems sometimes arise and things can go wrong. Sometimes things don't go according to plan, and it's your job to communicate about them in a way that doesn't ruin your relationships with customers, coworkers, managers, the public, and other stakeholders. As a business representative, you may have to write messages ending business relationships, declining proposals, announcing price increases, refusing requests for donations, terminating employees, turning down invitations, or responding to unhappy customers. Rarely are people happy when they receive such kind of messages, because these messages can be disappointing, irritating, and sometimes they can trigger anger in the receiver. That's why they should be written very, very much carefully. The bad feelings associated with disappointing news can generally be reduced if the receiver knows the reasons for the rejection of his application, for example. If you explain it as a writer, if you explain it well, why the application was rejected, then probably the effect of the bad news will be reduced. The effect can also be reduced if the receiver feels that the news was revealed sensitively in a way that respects the feelings of the recipient and a way that shows identification and empathy with him or her. The effect can also be reduced if the recipient thinks the matter was treated seriously and fairly. So, I think it is your responsibility as a representative of a company, as someone who is writing to convey bad news, I think it is your responsibility to draft and craft your negative message in a way that makes the recipient at least understand why the negative message was necessary, and in the best cases, make him accept that bad news. But I think this is easier said than done. We all tend not to accept bad news, especially if this bad news is very, very disappointing and very much irritating. So, delivering bad news is not the happiest writing task you may have, but it can be gratifying if you do it effectively and if you manage to achieve the goals of delivering bad news. Basically, there are some goals that we need to achieve when we want to deliver bad news. We can distinguish between primary goals and secondary goals, major goals and minor goals. Now, among the primary goals that we seek to achieve when delivering bad news is to make the receiver understand the bad news. Of course, accepting it is very hard, but at least we need to make the recipient understand why the bad news was necessary. Another goal is to help the receiver accept the bad news. And finally, to maintain a positive image of you and your organization. At the end of the day, you want to maintain that positive image of your organization and yourself as a business communicator. And the secondary goals that probably you may seek to achieve are to reduce bad feelings, okay? You write in a way that reduces the bad feelings and reduces the effect of the bad news on the recipient. To convey fairness, you may seek to convey fairness, to show the recipient that the decision taken was fair and just. To eliminate future correspondence, and when I say to eliminate future correspondence, I mean that you strive to be as clear as possible so that the recipient will not go for further correspondence to ask for clarifications or justifications. And finally, to avoid creating legal liability or responsibility for you or your organization. Now, these are minor goals. Of course, they are very ambitious goals, and we don't always achieve them all, but if you manage to achieve some of them, or the majority of them, then you are a very good business communicator. Now, we'll move to talk about the direct and indirect strategies for delivering bad news. Of course, I mentioned before in a previous audio that we have two approaches when we want to deliver bad news. The first one is called the direct approach and the indirect approach. Some people call them strategies or methods or whatever. Now, both of them can be implemented. Both of them can be useful in delivering bad news, but in specific situations that I'm going to shed light on in a while. I have mentioned before in a previous video, if you remember, that if you have good news, you can resort to the direct strategy. You can implement the direct strategy and simply announce the good news from the very beginning. That's the method, or that's the approach that is recommended for good news. But if you have bad news is generally easier to accept when broken gradually, when introduced indirectly, and when presented in a tactful and a diplomatic way. Revealing bad news slowly and indirectly shows sensitivity to your reader. In the indirect approach, we prepare the reader. We tend to soften the impact, okay? But a blunt announcement of disappointing news might cause the receiver or the reader to stop reading and throw the message aside. The indirect strategy enables you to keep the reader's attention until you have been able to explain the reasons for the bad news. In fact, the most important part of a bad news message is the explanation part, in which you explain why the bad news was very necessary to make. Now let me explain the pattern for bad news messages. This pattern consists of 4 parts, as I'm going to explain now. The first part is called the buffer. The second part, reasons. The third part, bad news. And the fourth part, closing. Now what is the buffer? The buffer is a very short introduction in which we open the message with a neutral but meaningful statement that does not mention the bad news, okay? We said that we are using now the indirect approach in which the bad news is kept until a later time in the message. So the buffer is just like an introduction that prepares the reader for the bad news. The second part is reasons, and here what should you do? Here you explain the causes of the bad news before disclosing it, before stating the bad news bluntly and openly. The third part, bad news, now here you reveal the bad news without emphasizing it. Because the more you emphasize it, the more irritating it will be. The more you emphasize it, the more disappointing it will be. So try just to mention it in a smooth way, in a way that has less effect on the reader. If you keep emphasizing it every now and then the effect would be bigger. Provide an alternative or compromise if possible. if there is an alternative or compromise or something to resolve the problem, you can suggest it and provide it. And at the end, which is the closing part, end with a personalized, forward-looking, pleasant statement. Avoid referring to the bad news again. All right? So you close pleasantly with a forward-looking statement. Now, this is the 4 parts pattern for writing bad news messages. This is how it goes, from the buffer to the reasons, then bad news, then the closing part. Now, the question that you might ask at this stage is when to use the indirect strategy, or in what situations should we implement this strategy. The indirect strategy, as we said before, does not reveal the bad news immediately, and it enables you to keep the reader's attention until you have been able to explain the reasons for the bad news. It also enables you to soften negative news. Using this strategy makes bad news easier to accept when broken gradually and when introduced indirectly. Now, these are a few situations in which the indirect strategy may be useful. Number 1, when the bad news is personally upsetting. If the negative news involves the receiver personally, such as layoff notice, the indirect strategy makes sense. Okay, now in this case, it makes sense and it is recommended. Telling an employee that he or she no longer has a job is probably best done in person and by starting indirectly and giving reasons first. So as you see in this first situation, if the bad news is very upsetting and very disappointing to the receiver, you'd better use the indirect strategy. The second situation in which we can probably use the indirect strategy is when the bad news will provoke a hostile reaction. When your message will irritate or infuriate the recipient and makes him angry, the indirect method may be best, okay? In this situation, you'd better use the indirect strategy. It begins with a buffer, as I explained before, and then reasons, then the bad news, and finally, the close-in. A blunt announcement, a direct announcement, may make the receiver stop reading. The third situation is when the bad news threatens the customer relationship. If the negative message may damage the customer relationship, the indirect strategy may help salvage the customer bond. Beginning slowly and presenting reasons that explain what happened can be more helpful than directly announcing bad news or failing to adequately explain the reasons. And the last possible situation in which you can use the indirect approach is when the bad news is unexpected. Okay? It comes very suddenly and unexpectedly. Now, readers who are totally surprised by bad news tend to have a more negative reaction than those who expected it. Of course, when you expect something bad, when it comes, the effect of it is less than if you don't expect it. Now, this is said, the indirect approach does not guarantee that the recipients of your message will be pleased. Of course, they would not be pleased because, after all, bad news is just bad news. However, many communicators prefer to use it. Okay? Now let me read you an example of a message written using the indirect approach. Remember that we have 4 parts: the buffer, the explanation, the bad news, and then a positive closing. Now let me read you the buffer first. Thank you for your order. We appreciate your interest in our product and we are confident you will love it. Explanation. We are writing to let you know that this product has been unexpectedly popular with over 10,000 orders submitted on the same day you placed yours. Now the bad news. This unexpected increase in demand has resulted in a temporary out-of-stock situation. Despite a delay of 2 to 3 weeks, we will definitely fulfill your order, as well as gift you a 5 coupon towards your next purchase. The closing? While you wait for your product to ship, we encourage you to use the enclosed $5 coupon toward the purchase of any product in our online catalog. We appreciate your continued business and want you to know that our highest priority is your satisfaction. Now here, the writer of this message announces the bad news, which is that the product purchased and ordered by the customer is out of stock, but the writer skillfully and inventively announces the news. Because he uses the indirect strategy in which he started with a buffer, then he explained the reasons why the bad news was necessary to make, and then he announced the bad news in a very soft way, in a way that eases the effect of this bad news. And to maintain the respect and the satisfaction of the reader, he provides him with a $5 coupon to use to buy something or to purchase something from their online catalog. So if you read such kind of letter, the effect of the bad news would certainly be less than if it is not well written. Alright. Now, despite the fact that the indirect approach is recommended for negative messages and bad news, the direct approach or the direct pattern with the bad news first may be more effective in some situations. Now, let's talk about these situations in which the direct approach can be better. When the receiver may overlook the bad news, if you think that the receiver may not pay the necessary attention to the bad news, then be direct and straightforward. Like, for example, rate increases, changes in service, new policy requirements. These critical messages might require directness to ensure the attention of the recipients and the receivers. Another situation, when organization policy suggests directness. Some companies expect all internal messages and announcements, even bad news, to be straightforward and presented without turning around the bush, as we say. Now, in this case, the direct approach is better. The third situation is when the receiver prefers directness. Some people prefer directness and they don't like the idea of being indirect, okay? Busy managers may prefer directness as well. If you know that the reader prefers that the facts be presented straight away, use the direct pattern. The fourth situation is when firmness is necessary. Messages that must demonstrate determination and strength should not use delaying techniques, should not use the technique we talked about with the indirect approach. And the fifth situation is when the bad news is not damaging. The bad news has no effect on the recipient. If the bad news is insignificant, it's not very important, such as a small increase in a cost, and if it doesn't personally affect the receiver, then the direct strategy certainly makes sense, okay? Now, as far as the writing process is concerned, we apply the same writing process we talked about before that we use with any other business messages. Namely, the process in which there are 3 stages: the pre-writing stage, the writing stage or the writing phase, and the post-writing stage, okay? What should we do in the pre-writing stage? In the pre-writing stage for bad news messages, we should analyze, anticipate, and adapt. We analyze the bad news so that we can anticipate its effects on the receiver. If the disappointment will be mild, we announce the bad news directly, okay? We use the direct approach. If the bad news is serious or personal or very much damaging, then we should consider techniques to reduce the pain, okay? Adapt your words when you are writing a bad news message. Adapt your words to protect the receiver's ego and personality, okay? Choose words that show you respect the reader as a responsible, valuable person. Now that's for the pre-writing stage. In the writing stage, you can gather information and brainstorm for ideas. Write down all the reasons you have that explain the bad news. If 4 or 5 reasons prompted your negative decision, concentrate on the strongest and safest ones. Remember, avoid using weak reasons because these weak reasons can give the chance to readers to seize on them and reject the entire message altogether. After selecting your best reasons, outline the 4 parts of the bad news: buffer, reasons, bad news, and closing. This is in case you are using the indirect message. Alright, and in the third stage or the third phase, which is the post-writing, what should we do? We should revise, proofread, and evaluate our message, okay? You are ready now at this stage, you are ready to switch positions and put yourself into the receiver's shoes, okay? You should look at the problem from the receiver's perspective. Is your message too blunt? Is it too direct? Is it too subtle and complex? Does the message make the refusal or the denial or the bad news announcement clear? So prepare the final version and proofread for format, punctuation, and correctness. Alright, now that's for the writing process. And now we should look at how you can avoid exposing yourself and your employer to legal liability in writing negative messages. Although we can't always anticipate the consequences of our words, we should be alert, we should be aware to 3 causes of legal difficulties, okay? Number 1, abusive language. Number 2, careless language. And number 3, what communication experts call the good guy syndrome. Using abusive language can indeed cost you and your company a lot. When we say using abusive language, we mean using words that can be defaming to the receiver. For example, calling people names such as deadbeat, crook, or quack. Now, using such kind of names can get you into trouble. This is called defamation, to defame a person. And defamation is the legal term for any false statement that harms an individual's reputation. When the abusive language is written, it is called libel. When spoken, it is slander. Now, such kind of abusive language can be actionable, and when we say actionable, we mean that it can result in a lawsuit. It can be actionable if it is false, of course, and if it is damaging to one's good name, and if it is published. And when we say published, we mean that it is written or spoken with the presence of others. Another thing that can create legal problems for you and your company is careless language. Careless language includes statements that could be damaging or misinterpreted, okay? You should use words that communicate only what you intend to convey. And finally, the good guy syndrome. What is this good guy syndrome, and what do communication experts mean by the good guy syndrome? The good guy syndrome is the use of statements that make you feel good but may be misleading or inaccurate. Of course, most of us hate to have to reveal bad news. That is to say, to be the bad guy. We want to be the good guy, and hence the name the good guy syndrome. To make ourselves look better, to make the receiver feel better, and to maintain good relations, we are sometimes tempted to make statements that are legally dangerous. Now let me give you a concrete example to explain this. 3 candidates applied at the same time for a job. 2 of them are young men, and 1 of them is a young woman. After a few days, the young woman received a letter declining her the job and announcing the bad news that she was not accepted. She learned that the two young men were accepted. She was rejected simply because she is not competent enough, not because of her gender and not because of any other considerations. When she opened the letter, this is what she read. Although you were by far the most qualified candidate we interviewed, unfortunately we have decided we do not have a position for a person of your talents at this time. So here, the writer of this letter wanted to show kindness and empathy and wanted to praise the candidate, but he used the wrong words, or he used what we call the good guy syndrome. If she is indeed the most qualified candidate they interviewed, she should be accepted, isn't it? Of course, she should be accepted. So the woman decided to issue a lawsuit against the company, and the court found in favor of the rejected candidate. It agreed that a reasonable inference could be made from the partner's letter that she was the most qualified candidate. So such kind of uncalculated language that springs from your willingness to appear like smarter, kinder, or nicer can cause you a lot of trouble. In business communication, such kind of language is not acceptable, and you may be held accountable for any word that you write. Business communicators act as agents of their organizations. Their words and decisions and their opinions are assumed to represent those of the organization. So if you want to convey personal feelings or personal opinions, then you can use that on your own computer and on paper, not on a paper with the letterhead of the company, if you see what I mean here. Now we come to the point where we talk about some techniques to convey bad news effectively. First, explain clearly and completely. Your goal as a business communicator is to make your readers understand and, in the best cases, accept the bad news. Recipients should not have to call or write to clarify your message. Okay? Then project a professional image. Even when irate and angry customers sound threatening and overstate their claims, you should strive to stay calm, to put your nerves in the fridge, as we say, and maintain politeness so that you can project a professional image. Convey empathy and sensitivity. Try to use language that respects the receiver but also attempts to reduce bad feelings. Empathy is even more than sympathy. When you are empathetic towards a person, you identify with that person in terms of how he or she feels. Be fair. When you can show that the decision was fair, impartial, and rational, receivers are far more likely to accept the negative news. And finally, maintain friendly relations. A final goal is to demonstrate your desire to continue pleasant relations and to regain the confidence of the reader. So implementing these tips while writing negative messages and bad news messages, you can convey the bad news effectively. Now we come to the last point in my audio lecture, which is ethics and the indirect strategy. In fact, a lot of people worry that the indirect strategy is unethical or manipulative because the writer deliberately delays the main idea. But consider the alternative. Breaking bad news bluntly can cause pain and hard feelings. By delaying bad news, you soften the blow somewhat and you ease the shocking effect of the bad news, and also you ensure that your reasoning will be read while the receiver is still receptive. One expert communicator recognized the significance and the importance of the indirect strategy when he said, people must believe the reasons why before they will listen to the details of what and when. I repeat this saying again. People must believe the reasons why before they will listen to the details of what and when. And for him, this is the importance of the indirect strategy because it explains the reasons first and then gives the what and the when. In using the indirect strategy, of course, you are not trying to deceive or to hide the news, okay? Your motives are not to deceive and hide the news, but rather your goal is to be a compassionate, empathetic, and of course, an effective communicator. All right, so that's it for today's audio lecture. I hope I made things clear. I hope by now you understand what I mean by the direct and the indirect strategies for delivering bad news. And I hope also that you'll be able to opt for the right one